Welcome to MamaTokTok's A Different Take, a podcast where everyday people around the globe share a different take on everyday issues. I'm your host, Ebi Mambo, and I'm pleased you're joining us today. Welcome.
Hi, Dr. Angela Onya, and welcome to MamaTokTok's A Different Take. I am thrilled to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's great to see you. Thanks so much. My name is Angela. I'm actually not Dr. Angela Onya, but Dr. Pillay.
Okay.
I still practice on my maiden name.
Oh, wow. Okay.
My son is actually Dr. Onya. So.
Okay. To keep the two things separate. I like that.
It's great to be here, and thank you really so much for having me.
The pleasure is all mine. When I conceived of this idea to have you come on the show, it was on the back of the coronavirus, quite frankly, and all the focus and emphasis that has been put on medical practitioners and everyone in the medical field who's actually on the forefront fighting this virus. And it just got me thinking about other times in history where we've had to deliver medical care under really tough circumstances. So I wanted to start a series of MamaTokTok that really looked at difficult times in history, whether it's the coronavirus, the Ebola crisis, war times, and then of course I thought about apartheid in South Africa and just thought, what was it like as a doctor to deliver healthcare under that system, which was so segregated by race and class? So I thought your experience is a fascinating one that I wanted to share with my guests. So I'm really, really happy we could make this happen.
Well, that's interesting that you thought about it, because with almost, 95 days that we've been in lockdown, I've had enough time to reflect on my past and my life experiences. And then I sort of realized that how does one, not how, but how did I attack the other crisis in my life? Mm-hmm. And how did the other challenges? So it brought me to realize that, the motto in my life has always been, don't ask why this is happening. Ask how do you face this challenge and how do you carry on from there? And so I was thinking about my past, and if I could give you a little bit of history, that yes. I was actually born a year after the nationalist government took power in this country. So in 1948 they took power, and in 1949 I was born. And they passed an act which was Population Control Act, where they divided us up into different populations. It was white, black, colored, Indian. And what happened was that my father came to work in Cape Town from Durban, and he was arrested when I was about a year old and put into prison, and then deported back to where he came from. Because,
what was his crime?
For being in Cape Town without a permit, without a pass. You weren't allowed to move around the country because of the Population Control Act. They wanted to separate different populations. Mm-hmm. So my dad, having been arrested, separated from his wife and child here, and just sent back on a train back to where he was from. And so I guess that sort of almost put my father in a position where I wouldn't say radicalized, but, all his life he started fighting for equality. So he was determined to come back and be with his family, with his wife and child. But before that, my mom then traveled to meet him back in Durban, because, she had a 1-year-old kid, and they didn't care. They just separated families. So I think that was the start of it all, where my father obviously fought for equality. Most of his life, he was part of the struggle. And that impacted on the way we grew up.
Yeah.
Because You understand? And then on top of it all, my mom goes to meet his family in Durban, and she was ostracized because she was not a Hindu. So she had to deal with cultural separation as well. So for a woman, a child, this actually impacted our lives. For most of our lives growing up, my father made us believe that we should be empowered, even though we were girl children, fight for our rights, and, you know, always grew up with the idols that he imposed on us, like the principles of Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela and Dr. Martin Luther King. We had to listen to I Have a Dream speeches, you know, over and over again in our home.
It's amazing, though. It's amazing that he taught you that as children.
Well, this is it. So, I mean, that's how we actually grew up. And so apartheid impacted on our lives in every sphere. And my father felt that the only way to beat the system was to educate yourself. And he always said, what you have in your head, they can never take away from you. Yeah. Because, I mean, he grew up around police brutality and detention without trial, you know, all the horrors of apartheid. Even at school, when I started going to school, some of our teachers were imprisoned because they were trying to incite students to rise up, for instance. But I had to remain focused, you know, because I was bent, and my father pushed us to educate us and gain your degrees and really just empower yourself as a woman and fight them that way instead of going out into streets and fighting.
And you were the first of four girls? Is that
That's right? I was the eldest. And so I had to, you know, face all these hurdles. At high school, I was conflicted because, you know, coming from a home where Mahatma Gandhi's passive resistance principles were instilled in us. And here at school, we had some radical students who wanted to go out and protest and, you know, take to the streets. So as a young teenager, you were conflicted because you're growing up, you know, with all the different choices you have to make, and a normal teenage life, which was disrupted by all the horrors of apartheid. So that actually led me to believe that, you know, the main thing is now to just study on and then try. I felt that I wanted to do medicine so that I could help my community. But then facing all those obstacles, you weren't allowed to study at any university if you were a person of color. So at University of Cape Town, which was a so-called white university, they only took 25 people of color per annum to study medicine out of a class of 200 white students. Wow. So you had to get a special permit again from the government to be able to study at a white university. And so the first year after I left high school, I didn't receive this permit. And it meant that I either just leave and go to work, because, I mean, it was difficult for my father to keep me studying all the time because he was just a waiter in a hotel. But I pressed on, and I decided I would reapply again. So the following year I managed to get in. And then I got into this white university where you were faced with integration, in other words.
Yeah.
Because here you were mixing with people of all colors. And, you know, in our schools, we were all segregated. It was just people of color. And yeah, so there were the challenges that I had to deal with, first of all. And I made many friends, but you also then found that you dealt with people who didn't accept you because they still thought of you as an inferior person. So we had to work hard to prove ourselves at this university, much harder than the other students, obviously.
Yeah.
And it was a continual battle showing them that we were equal and we were even sometimes better, you know. We were often patronized, because they couldn't believe that somebody of color got better grades than some of the white students, you know, that type of attitudes that we dealt with. Although, I mean, and then I also realized that racism was entrenched in our society, because it wasn't just people judging you on the color of your skin, but I found out that even at that university, there was anti-Semitism. Some of the Jewish students at the university weren't accepted by other white students. And that was a revelation to me, because I always thought that was just because we were, of color, that's why we were discriminated against.
Mm-hmm.
But going to this university where there were Jewish students, and it was really shocking to realize that, you know, it's so entrenched in our society.
Yeah.
And that led me to feel that I had to always fight and you know, be part of the struggle in this country.
So Dr. Pillay, I'm just going to step back a bit, because you've given us quite a bit of history here, and I want to unpack some of this. When you talk about requiring a permit to attend school, what was the basis of that? Was it that you had not made the requisite grades, or was it you had made the grades, but they were tapped out of the number of students of color who could attend?
That's right, because they only took 25 people, per annum for the first year medical class. So obviously, if you just fell out of that, number of students, you had to reapply. So the next year I managed to get in.
And how did they decide which 25 they choose?
Well, that remains to be seen. I suppose, all sorts of corruption as well. People could pay to get in, and that's an old story. That also made me fight the fact that, you had to try and also fight corruption in this society, not just, equality.
I'm also fascinated by the story of your father. So here you were, four daughters he was trying to raise and ensure that you had a good life. And the eldest he's trying to send to medical school, and he's a waiter. How was this possible for him to do at that time when he was only allowed to do certain jobs? He had a family of 6, right? Wife and 4 children. How was your father able to navigate that and actually get you and your sisters through school?
It was very difficult. And, as a waiter, there was also a system of job reservation in this country. If you were black, you weren't allowed to rise up above to a level where you were in charge of anything. My dad had to train young white school leavers to be managers above him. And, these were all part of the reasons why he was so vehement about us attaining as much education as we could to get out of that whole system. And also he told us many times about, the humiliation he had to endure by white patrons who treated him as if he was, just a little boy. And these are the stories that made us feel that, it's such an evil system that we're going to have to struggle and fight this whole system. And the only way we could do it was to empower ourselves as women.
Yeah. And so in the time that you were in medical school, was there a system that kind of determined where you got to do your clinical trainings, for example, or once you were at, in school, were all the tools and all the teachers and all the labs available to all the students? How did that work?
No, of course not. We were not allowed to go into the white side of the hospitals. The hospitals were divided as well. Only white patients in certain hospitals, and people of color in different hospitals. So we were not allowed to touch or examine white patients. And we could only train in hospitals for coloreds and black people. So that was a challenge in itself.
Yeah.
Can you believe that the white students could come and gain as much experience amongst the poorer communities and the people of color?
That was going to be my next question. So they could come into black communities and Indian communities and get the training that they needed, but you were not allowed.
We weren't even allowed to in our anatomy classes to work on a white cadaver.
They're dead. What does it matter?
Exactly. Well, that is the evil of apartheid. It was crazy. Their rules were totally, sick, I would say.
I'm going to be a bit personal for you now, because sometimes we talk about these things as systemic things, but these are systemic things affecting real people. So on a day-to-day basis for you, how did you keep sane and engaged and just, positive enough to get through? What are some of the things, some coping mechanisms that you had to kind of rally around yourself to pull through? Because I know things like this affect people in very different ways. What was it like for you personally?
Well, it was very frustrating, but, we made many friends. We met up with white people who were actually quite normal and friendly and accepted us. And it seemed like I realized that some of them were just happy to maintain the status quo. Others had no idea about how apartheid impacted on the lives of the other students of color. For instance, I had made friends with one student who one day, we were quite good friends. We would talk about normal things like, families, and we had fun together. And then one day she said, let's go to a movie this afternoon. And I said, but I can't go with you to a movie because they separated. I'm not allowed to go into a white cinema. And she was totally shocked. She had never realized that I wondered. She'd been growing up going to a white cinema, never wondered why there were no people of color in there. She probably thought that they couldn't afford it or something like that. But she had accepted it, all her life. She was now in her early 20s and invites me to go with her to a movie. But she was genuinely shocked when I said to her, but I'm not allowed to go into the movie house with you. I have to go into a black cinema. So, you realize that some people grew up with just accepting their privileges and the status quo.
That is so poignant. I was having a conversation. So last week's video release was a conversation with me and a woman who's become a good friend now, and she's white. And we're talking about how it is that in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that's happening in America, what are the conversations that she's been having with her circle of friends? And she said to me, the one thing that has really surprised her is how little some people in her circle actually understand about Black culture. And I said to her, but that doesn't surprise me, because if you live in neighborhoods where everyone looks like you, if you go to schools where everyone looks like you go to churches and cinemas and that look like you, and then you go into the workplace and your first, second, third, fourth, fifth bosses all look like you, it's hard to compute an alternative world. But if you're in the minority engaging a majority culture, that picture looks very different. So I get it, but I'm still astounded that, you're talking about apartheid 40, 50, 60 years ago, and we're talking about 2020. This is still a thing that's happening.
Exactly. Well, this is what's, for me, when I've been watching what's going on in the States, it's almost like, living through apartheid all over again. I can't believe that up till today in the United States of America, which is supposed to be the democracy, you know, that everybody looked up to, and this is happening.
Yeah.
So,
Now,
yeah, it's crazy.
yeah, it blows my mind, and the fact that I always think of things in simple practical terms. If you have patients and you need a doctor, let's get doctors to the patients. But I can see how in a system like that, where certain doctors can't reach certain patients, how do you then meet the needs of the community? Because judging by what you're sharing, if there were ever a shortage of doctors to take care of white patients, what would they do? Since doctors of color couldn't touch white people. How did that work in a real sense? Outside school, when you began practicing, how did that really work?
Well, that's it. Then I was faced with further challenges because I practiced in a almost township. As you know, with forced removals, people were moved out of the city into what they call townships. And it was all on basis of color because of the Group Areas Act, which the government had installed. And so I worked in poorer communities, which were mostly colored and black patients. And that led me to further challenges because now we dealt with socioeconomic problems more than health issues.
Yeah.
You understand? So most of my work as a GP was, I was a glorified social worker. You know, many patients, I had to deal with the poverty, with gender-based violence, alcoholism, substance abuse, also what we called intimate partner violence.
Yeah.
You know, and it was a challenge all the time having to work with that type of community. And that's when we also had to do a lot of volunteer work. And also I assisted the communities in raising funds to do, to help us in our own little clinics because we were short of equipment and we couldn't sit there and blame the government all the time.
Yeah.
Obviously we could, but we felt that we need to do something for ourselves as well. So we would raise funds for the children's hospital, raise funds to buy a sort of linear reactor for Curtis Care Hospital. And we did fundraising in addition to, you know, it was almost as I was doing some community service. I don't know for what crime, but.
Wow.
Yeah, and our communities were great because they all assisted. People understood. And I tried to impact on them that, you know, we can't sit by and cry that we don't have that in our local clinic and we don't have this. Let's try and do things for ourselves and, you know, let the community rally. So there's
something, what you just said reminds me of something we've talked about before, and your notion of victimhood and the whole idea that no matter how bad it gets, sometimes you just kind of have to find a way. Because if I'm hearing you correctly, in those circumstances, you could have screamed at the government all you want, but if they were not coming to your rescue, they were not coming to your rescue. And so what do you do?
Exactly. Right? That was my motto. I lived by the motto of not why, but how. You know, don't say, why is this happening? Why can't we do this? How do we carry on and face this crisis and this challenge that we have? And this is the reason why I've thought about it. And how do we face this whole crisis of COVID now?
Yeah.
You know, thinking about how do we carry on from here and not just sit there and feel sorry and say, why is this happening to me? You know, that type of thing.
And COVID is a very interesting one because when Ebola rolled around, the world could say, not my problem. It's happening in Africa, not my problem. When SARS came around, the world could say, not my problem. That's in Asia. I don't care. COVID is everywhere.
Exactly.
It's everywhere. Exactly. And so you cannot say, not my problem, because actually it is our problem collectively. And so it's been interesting to watch the world kind of galvanize But even still and yet, the world is still separate in how it's approaching something which is in everyone's backyard. So I find that fascinating. But Dr. Pillay, the other thing that we haven't talked about is you were a medical student, and in the course of that, you became a wife and a mother. Now, how did you balance all of this side by side with, in this oppressive regime, being a mother, being a wife, being just, how did you navigate that at the time? Right now, my generation talks a lot about, can women have it all? Should we have it all? We talk about it from a place of choice. At your time, was it even a choice?
Oh, definitely, it was a choice. And I often believe that life's what you make of it. So it's up to you to really go out there and fight the system all the time. But I was fortunate that I had a very caring husband who supported me throughout. I had a mother who was there to assist me with rearing my children. We had a very close family life, and my sisters were supportive. They would take charge of my children sometimes, and I'm eternally grateful to them. I had a good circle of friends, mostly women friends that kept me grounded, in other words.
Yes.
And helped me, carry on with mothering. My husband was amazing. He used to go with me to do house calls at night if I ever had to go and do a house call, because it was dangerous for me as a woman to go. So this is why I'm saying it's fortunate. I don't know how other women who maybe are single parents can manage, but for me it was different because I had a very supportive husband. He attended some medical meetings with me or conferences, and it was a joke because, I also had to battle gender issues. As a female, they didn't take you seriously, and we'd walk into this conference and the receptionist would point to me and say, oh, the spouses should go inside there, and they look at my husband and point him towards where the doctors were attending him.
And then you would tell him, honey, party's over there.
That's right. And they had special spouses programs for women mostly, because male doctors were in the majority. So my husband had to sit through table setting and floral arrangement, talks.
I can't picture that.
I know, but he was great because he used to keep those women laughing about everything and make jokes about it,
Oh,
until so that sort of thing. You had challenges as a woman doctor. They never took you really seriously. I even had a patient who, after she was a patient of mine for many years, got married, and then her husband said to her, no, you've got to change. You must go to my doctor. That type of attitude.
Yeah.
And he wanted her to attend his doctor after she married him. She came back, to me saying, I can't handle this. I've got such a good rapport with you for all the years that you've been my doctor, but now my husband's insisting that I no longer come to this practice. I must go to his doctor because that's a male doctor. But you see, those are the issues we were confronted with in that time. Yeah. So it wasn't just on the basis of your color. It was being a woman and fighting. Oh, of course. I mean, and that's when I sort of tried to empower a lot of my female patients to stand up for themselves. And, I used to get a patient coming in with a black eye, or, she was a victim of abuse. And at times I would put her in my car and drive her down to the police station to go and lay a charge against this man, while my other patients had to sit back and wait for me. But it was frustrating because next thing I hear that she's gone back to him.
Yes.
And, you had to deal with that all the time. And I was trying to get them to break the cycle of violence that, they had to endure by empowering themselves. So, as you see,
domestic violence is it's a really challenging one. We have an episode that's running right now. I think it's the one with the most views, actually, which is on domestic violence.
Yes, I've
And
watched that podcast about the couple that were one murdered and the other one
the murder suicide, yeah,
suicide. Yeah, it
yeah.
was very
And
sad.
the hardest thing for me when I was a volunteer with one of the domestic violence centers, it's exactly what you described. I would work with these women who wanted either a temporary restraining order or a permanent restraining order. They had a social worker, we'd go to the judge, we'd ask for a restraining order, then they'd go off, they'd be given housing and food, and the social worker would start to work to get them a job. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, I'd get a call to say, come back down to the center, we have a problem. And I'd say, what's wrong? Well, she went back, and so we had to roll back. And this happened so many times. I just thought there has to be a better way. But the whole idea that in the infrastructure is not actually built for women who want to get out, because if you get out and you have no job, if your community ostracizes you, if you are alone, or if you have children and you want your children to have the same father, or the stigma of divorce, it just felt like there were too many things that women were battling against that just made them go back. And so that line of work was a hard one to kind of navigate and to adjust. So I understand to a certain extent what you're saying about that. Now, when you look back, and you've been a physician for how many years?
Oh, I qualified in 1976. I forget how long that is.
Before I was born. What are some of your biggest lessons learned, or just reflections about that journey?
Well, as I've said before, it was so difficult because I was dealing with more socioeconomic problems all the time. You were fighting the system. It was difficult having to treat a patient, prescribe a certain medication, and send them back where they had to live in a shack. There was no electricity. If it was meant that they were diabetic and had to be on insulin, it had to be kept in a fridge. Where would they keep it? And so you were dealt with all these other challenges. It was not just treating. I mean, we weren't trained for that academically, and at university. Or nowadays they have programs where students are taken into the townships and they understand the problems that the communities have. But in my day, it was a white university. Everything was Eurocentric. You got your academic training, but when it came to dealing with the actual community and the poverty and, socioeconomic conditions were so poor that it became really soul-destroying sometimes. You had to really rethink, about your profession. But you had to carry on because you were making some form of, I believe that every drop counts, so we did our small bit to try and alleviate, the problems.
Yeah. Was there a physician association at the time after you graduated school, or was that not something that?
Yes, there was the Medical Association of South Africa, which you belonged to. You paid certain dues and subscriptions, but they really did nothing more for me at that time.
Okay. And the reason why I ask is building up on your previous point about a Eurocentric focus on the medical education. I met a nurse last year who was talking to me about the Nurses Association in the US. It's an African-American nurse, and she said, they go to association meetings, and the example she gave is they talk about what are the diseases plaguing the community. Mm-hmm. Now, you all think you're talking about the same community, right? But obviously you're not. And so they'd always come away talking about things like, type 1 diabetes. And the Black nurses would always be saying, but the issue in our community is type 2 diabetes, because that's what mostly afflicts Africans and African Americans. And the issue of lupus is more rampant in our community. So they were always trying to go in that direction. And the majority were always trying to go in that direction, in the opposite direction. And finally, there came a fracture, right, where they said, as an association, we can't seem to prioritize whose needs matter, because when we speak and we're talking about type 1 diabetes, it's not something I can take back to my community because it has no relevance there. So I had never even thought of things like that, right? But it started to help me think about how these associations are built and whether there's any form of intersectionality that's brought into the conversations about issues and how issues are solved.
Well, you see, the problem is, up till today now with COVID, we're still having the same problems, because if we have one positive case, how do you isolate that patient if they're all living in one or a 1 or 2 bedroomed little house? At the moment, it's difficult. The government is trying to set up quarantine areas, but it's not enough. And they're having to choose the sickest people. But it doesn't make a difference if one person is positive and they've got like 4 or 5 living in that little unit where they all now become infected. It's very, very difficult because, we just don't have the proper infrastructure for people to be isolated. And it was the same then, because we had a lot of tuberculosis and HIV in the country, which we were faced with. As much as it was, HIV wasn't as contagious as the pandemic we're dealing with now. It was sexually transmitted, but still, people, we had to be careful if they cut themselves and they were passing their fluids around in the house in some way or another. So we've learned lessons along the way, but it's not as great as the impact we're having at the moment with this pandemic, where it's a highly contagious disease.
One of the things that frustrated me at the very beginning of the pandemic was this line that was trending that said, "We're all in this together." And I know what the intention behind that was. It was a call for solidarity. But I wanted us to take the conversation a little bit further, right? Which was, we're all in this together, but we're not experiencing this thing the same way.
Definitely not. As you say, if you're living in a large home where you can, I've got a cousin who's got a huge house, her husband's a doctor. They've divided the house where he can go and live on the one side of the house because he's a doctor and he comes home. But what about all the other patients?
Yeah.
I also have a cousin whose husband's family have been infected. The one brother came home with the disease, was tested positive because he worked with people. And now his mother and his 2 brothers and 1 nephew, they all tested positive. Fortunately, they're all positive now, so they're in the house together. But what I mean was there was no way that he was able to isolate himself when he was first tested so that he could not pass it on to his family.
Yeah.
He just had to, so it's a serious problem we're having.
Back in March, I wrote an article about this. I was reflecting on the concept of home because all we were talking about during that time was home, right? Home-based learning, work from home, stay-home notices. And it just caused me to think about what home means during the pandemic. And so I was just struck by how we did have people who could, and it's no fault of theirs. Life is what it is. There are disparities, and that's what it is. But I was really struck by the fact that we could have exactly what you described. And my question was, what do we do about people living in slums in India, in favelas in Brazil, where now I think their numbers have just, oh my goodness,
skyrocketed. Also because of the politicians' policies. When you think about Bolsonaro and people like that. Fortunately, our president has started lockdown early enough, and we hope it was, enough. But our politicians and our president has done a good job as far as I'm concerned so far.
Yeah. What are some of the things that, looking back on your journey, it just fills your heart with so much joy in terms of, we've talked about some of the challenges, but I also just want to spend a bit of time just talking about the things that just, you look back and you say, my heart soars that I got to do XYZ.
Well, one thing I also learned is that, you know, as much as we had discrimination, but there were also many, many white people in this country who were, as I said, good people, in other words, who helped fight the system with us. And under circumstances where it was actually dangerous in some cases for them as well. I mean, one of my colleagues, Neil Agate, who graduated with me, was murdered by the police. And because he stood with the unions to fight, you know, this whole apartheid system, many, many white people assisted us in the fight and the struggle, which gave me a lot of hope for humankind, you know. So up till today, I mean, I had patients, often you would get, I would say, an employee attending my practice, and I'd get a call from the employer, even though she was maybe a domestic worker or something, and say, please see that she gets whatever she needs. We will pay, we will sort out. She's been a good worker, you know, that type of thing, which gave me a lot of hope for the country. And as a result, you know, you just felt that you had to fight the politicians, but not the people.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an important distinction. I've been having that conversation with some friends now about the US, where it's like, who's the problem, the policymakers or the people? I think it's a little bit on both sides, but it's really the policymakers that are driving a lot of what's happening in the larger society right now.
Yes, I mean, we were always fighting this whole sort of colonialist shackles that we had in the country, because these things were brought down from British rule and then into the Afrikaner rule. But as I said, many of the white people accepted their privileges because I guess it's probably human, you know, you get all the privileges and you grab what you can. And so I never had this sort of vendetta against all white people that I'm going to have to, you know, fight them. I felt that, you know, if we could educate some of them to understand what was going on, and I think that was the major thing, show them that we could be equal and better than what they thought of us. We were not inferior just because of the color of our skin.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were indoctrinated, you know, by their forefathers or whatever. So I never really had that attitude towards my fellow white students at university. I tried to show them that, you know, there is, you know, a lot of people amongst all of us, that we are all equal. And that was my motive for just carrying on.
Yeah. This has been really awesome for me. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about your history, your background. And before we close, I do have the 10 questions I want to ask you, because after unloading all of this, it's good to have some fun in. But is there any message you would want
it's long since I took an exam where I had to answer questions.
So we'll do the questions, and then I'll give you an opportunity to just speak to the audience and share any kind of insights, advice, reflections you want before we close it out.
Good.
So for the 10 questions, as I said before, I'll ask you and I'll give you 2 choices. You get to pick only one. You can't pick 2, and you cannot refuse to pick. That's what makes it fun.
Fire away.
All right. You are stuck on a desert island and can only have one food. Buba or Sorji?
Sorji, of course. Everybody knows that I love Sorji. When I visit family in Durban and they know I'm coming, I actually have to contend eating Sorji at every house because they all know that I love it. And then everybody decides, oh, she's coming, let's make Sorji. So I get so
Wonderful.
tired of having to eat Sorji at every home that I visit of my relatives.
And now that we've told everyone that's your favorite, you have more sorgy to see in your future when you visit kids. Okay. A weekend away in Church Haven or a weekend away in Sun City?
Oh no, Church Haven's one of the most tranquil, beautiful places in Cape Town, and it's a place that our summers are never complete until we go there every year.
Awesome. So, as a doctor all these years, which group of patients did you prefer to treat? Children or the elderly?
I think the elderly, and that came from my dad, who always dragged us along to go and visit old aunts and cousins and his family. And we used to moan about it every weekend when he'd say, no, but you've got to go and visit Auntie so-and-so. And he had spent lots of time with these old relatives. And I think that gave us that sense, although we didn't like it when we were children.
Yeah.
But those values stuck. And I think I spent a lot of time treating a lot of my elderly patients as if they were my own grandmothers and grandparents.
We're lucky to have you. If you had a magic wand and you could eliminate one thing, would it be racism or sexism?
I'd say racism because obviously, as I've said, it was something that I was born with. It started, with the whole of apartheid, and it impacted our lives throughout. And up till today, we still obviously subjected to a lot of racial issues in our country.
Okay. If you were to spend an entire day with one person, would it be Jackie Onassis or Lady Diana?
I think Lady Diana, she showed the world that she was right down to earth. Her status didn't matter. She spent a lot of time with children and people in Africa as well. So I think Diana would be the person that I'd spend time with.
Okay. If you had to go out on a date, would you rather go out on a date with George Clooney or Amitabh Bachchan?
Well, now that's a difficult one because I have a husband who is often mistaken for Amitabh Bachchan. And we went to Thailand one day and someone looked at him and said, hey, Amitabh Bachchan. And he said, shh, don't tell anyone, I'm only on holiday. So obviously, because of my husband, always being likened to Amitabh, I probably would choose him.
Okay.
Because, well, maybe I could tell you because, he's the love of my life. And, I often say, I think it was Michelle Obama who said, we were at school together, my husband and I. And at the time, it was never love at first sight. But like Michelle Obama says, never love at first sight, but love for the rest of your life.
Oh, that is so beautiful. Oh, yeah. I thought you would say the opposite because if you have Amitabh at home, then maybe you want one day out with George Clooney. But it's so beautiful.
Like I said to you now, it's because it's the love for the rest of your life. So I wouldn't want anybody else.
Oh, so beautiful. You make me envious about this kind of amazing love that just endures. Okay. If you could ask one person this question, what were you thinking? Would you ask Hitler or would you ask Henrik Verwoerd? I don't know if I say his name right. Henrik Verwoerd, is that how you say that?
Hendrik Verwoerd, yes, of course. I mean, although I think he adopted Hitler's policies, so one would actually have to go back and ask Hitler what he was thinking and how he made many people sort of adopt his policies, because apartheid was, you know, obviously a lot of the principles that Hitler imposed on race and so on was what Hendrik Verwoerd adopted. So I would say I would ask Hitler.
You go to the source.
Yes.
Which trait do you most prize and would teach your children? Is it loyalty or hard work?
That's a difficult one because both are very important in our lives. Hard work gets, you know, you have to work for everything in this life. And you also have to be loyal. So, yeah, I guess hard work.
Hard work?
Yes.
These questions were designed to be difficult. If they were easy, it wouldn't make this fun. If you had to choose between a night out playing the slots with Faisal or a night out dancing with your sisters, what would you choose?
Well, I spend a lot of time with Faisal, so I think a night out with my sisters because they, as I said, keep me grounded. And Faisal doesn't like the slots anyway, so.
This is awesome. For retirement, if Cape Town is not an option, would you rather retire in Durban or in Singapore?
I'm not sure about that because Cape Town has always been, to me, the most beautiful city in the world. And also because of my family ties, I would choose Cape Town still because family is very, very important to me. And
if it's not an option.
Oh, you mean if it's not an option? Oh,
Yeah.
well, then Singapore, definitely.
Okay. And that was the 10th question. But I have one more that I think is just an awesome question. So if you don't mind, I'll ask it.
Okay.
Do you prefer beginnings or endings?
That I would say now the beginnings because it made me reflect. That was going to be what I was going to tell you about afterwards. That reflecting on the past now, I realized that my past is very important at this age. What's there now post-COVID for me as a person of this age? I mean, I can't see that I'm going to start a new career now or... and so, but my message to young people, you see, would be that for them, it's going to be totally different because they're going to have to think about their future. And I've been reflecting more on my past to put all the pieces of the puzzle of my life together. And how much more is there that I'm going to do? I'm not going to stop, but, you know, my beginnings were very, very important to me. And that was what shaped my whole life. And as I said, life is what you make of it.
Yeah.
So exactly, the beginning would be the answer.
Beautiful. So I'm just going to close out with a few things I've personally taken away from our conversation. The whole idea of not why, but how. When something happens, instead of asking why me or why did this happen, ask how, with the idea of getting through it. I gather from the conversation that resilience is really important to you, which is part of how. Just staying the course and figuring it out. And hard work. Hard work goes hand in hand with those. And while loyalty is an important thing, hard work is really, really critical as well.
Sure.
And then the thing that just brought a big smile to my face and made my day is not love at first sight, but love for a lifetime.
Well, yeah, that's why we've had a very successful marriage. And I think it was good for my my two sons, because my husband was a wonderful father, and I think he's passed it on to his sons. I can really say I'm so proud that they are such wonderful fathers to their children. That's what's made me very, very proud. That, it's very important to have a very good family life.
Yes, it is. Well, thank you so much for the time you spent with us. It's been an absolute pleasure for me. And I think our listeners and viewers would absolutely enjoy listening to this as much as I have. So thank you again.
Well, thank you for having me. And really, it's been great chatting to you. Thank you.
Likewise. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday.
You too. Enjoy. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please share your thoughts in the comments below or email us at ab@mamatoktok.com. Continue the conversation in your homes and communities. And when you join us next week, invite a friend or many. For more diverse perspectives on everyday issues from everyday people around the globe, subscribe to our podcast at mamatoktok.com/a different take. And join our online family by following us on Twitter and Instagram. Until we meet again, I'm your host, AB Mambo. Sigashina, stay well.